You are listening to the Charles Bonnet Syndrome podcast. My name is Shaimond Foy, and I have two special guests with me today. One is Gareth Brookes, who is a graphic novelist and a researcher. And I also have Dr. Gary Cusick, who's no stranger to the podcast. He's joining me with this discussion today also. So how are you both doing?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Very good, thank you.
All right, and thank you for being here. So can you talk a little bit about your background and what you do?
I make graphic novels and comics. I'm trained as a printmaker, and currently I'm doing a PhD at Central St Martin's in London, researching comics, specifically haptic visuality and tactility in comics narratives.
Doing a lot of great things. Well, I come to know you because Dr. Gary Cusick came across your graphic novel. It's called 1,000 Colored Castles, and the main character in there has Charles Bonnet Syndrome. And as everyone knows, this is the Charles Bonnet Syndrome podcast. So I would definitely like to discuss a little more about that novel. Can you tell me what was the inspiration for you writing that graphic novel?
Sure. So I guess it was around the mid-noughties. My mum told me that my grandma was suffering from a very rare eye condition. This is how it was presented to me. I can't remember if she told me the name of it, but she explained to me that my grandma was experiencing hallucinations. I think one was a terracotta army coming out of the fireplace. Another one was flowers growing in the house. But it was kind of presented to me as like, oh, don't mention it to her. You know, my grandma was of the generation where, you know, the war generation, where they never complained or grumbled about anything, and it kind of embarrassed them to talk about, you know, problems like that. So I kind of didn't really mention it too much, but I did have one conversation with her where I asked her what she could see out of the window, and she described burning cars in the garden. And she described soldiers walking around in the garden. And I think she said that previously she'd seen stuff like science fiction buildings in the distance, which seems very strange because I can't even imagine my grandma having watched too many science fiction programs. So I don't know what that must have looked like. And I think the other one was, scary looking flowers, like huge flowers in the house. So, I didn't really mention it that much to her again. I think since finding out about it, since that time, I've realised that she was actually quite lucky to have been sort of diagnosed and having had the condition explained to her in a way where she didn't worry about it, and she was kind of laid back and didn't really it seemed like it was a nuisance to her and just an annoyance. And I think that's kind of, so we didn't really talk about it that much more, but then subsequently it must have been about over 10 years later, and she died, you know, maybe 2 or 3 years before me starting the book. I was looking around for a project to do, and I asked my mum what was the condition that grandma had, because I remembered this conversation, and she told me it was Charles Bonnet. And then I started looking into it and just becoming completely fascinated by it and wishing I'd had more conversations with my grandma about it. So that was really the thing that started the book. And also because I'm an artist, I don't always have a lot of money, and her house was empty, you know, after she passed away. So I went to live there for a few years and rent-free, which was great. But I was almost kind of in the set of the comic, and I began thinking about what it must have been like to have these experiences, and really that situation, and remembering this conversation that I'd had with my mum and my grandma about it is what started me off making 1,000 Colored Castles.
How long did it take you to write the book?
I think it was about 3 years, which is pretty good for a graphic novel. Yeah, it was about 3 years. And that was working maybe 5 days a week.
One thing that I like about your book is it's one thing to hear someone talk about hallucinations that they're experiencing, and another thing to see it because I'm about halfway through the book,
Mm.
and I look forward to finishing it. And it's the things that I don't want to spoil the book in case anyone wants to get the book, but it's amazing all the things that your grandmother, I'm going to take it that that you kind of pattern this after that she's seen. And the hallucinations that I've seen so far are during the day because some people only have them when they're relaxing at night.
Mm.
But she's at the grocery store and she sees them. She's seeing
Mm.
cars on fire during the day, and you really did a good job of capturing that.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted it to be. I mean, in some ways, this book isn't for people that suffer from Charles Bonnet syndrome because it's a visual graphic novel. A lot of the illustrations are quite small, a lot of the text is quite small, but I wanted to bring people into that dilemma of not being able to trust what you're seeing, to really put them in the place of the Charles Bonnet sufferer and um, make people sort of feel what it must be like to like have these sudden, very surreal, very uncanny hallucinations and how you kind of navigate that in your daily life.
You did a great job of that. I wanted to go back a little bit to talk about your grandmother because you said once she realized what the condition was, she was kind of able to manage it. At least that's my understanding. Just
Yeah,
identifying that it was Charles Bonnet syndrome, she was able to kind of cope with it. A lot of people
yeah.
are, and I would think probably most people can, but there's some people that still aren't able to do that. What did she? Do you have any insight into that? Did she elaborate on that, or do you have anything you'd like to share about that?
I mean, it's really hard to tell because there must have been a period of time where she had begun having these hallucinations, but not. There must have been a gap between that and getting the diagnosis. As I say, I think she was very lucky to have that diagnosis, and I think that after she understood it, she was complete. She was a lot calmer about it, and I think that's really key with Charles Bonnet. Like having that knowledge is really like important for people. So really, like in a lot of ways, raising awareness about Charles Bonnet syndrome is super important with for this condition. I think because it just alleviates all that worry. The worry that you're going mad or dementia and things like this. But she was of that war generation where they didn't really talk about a lot of things that they'd experienced. And I mean, she died of cancer years after, and she never even told anyone that she had cancer. So this is the kind of this is the kind of level of they didn't that whole generation didn't seem to want to complain about things like this. So it's very hard for me to know, you know, what it was like between and how long the gap was between having the first experiences and getting the diagnosis. But I'm very glad, and I think she was lucky to have had, have been able to understand the condition. Like I don't know who explained it to her, but whoever that person was, I'd like to thank them because that clearly made it a lot easier. And she carried on looking. The other thing about that generation is the gender roles are very, very set. So she just carried on looking after my granddad and making his boiled eggs or whatever, and didn't complain any further than that really. But I think things are better now, and people are more inclined to talk about their experiences and things that are troubling them. But yeah, I think she didn't seem to either it didn't bother her or she didn't want to talk about it that much. I don't know which.
In the 90s, she was able to find out about it and someone knew about it
Mm,
because a lot of people are more unfamiliar with it. Even though Charles Bonnet identified it probably going on 300 years ago, it's
mm,
still not really relatively known.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So I understand that you took a little time to do a little research yourself before you wrote this novel. Could you share a little bit about some of the things you learned? And I even think you maybe said you spoke to Dr. Dominic Fitch or Judith Potts or
Yes,
anything you'd like to share about that
yeah.
experience.
I mean, the main bit of research. I mean, I read quite a lot around it. I read Oliver Sacks' book that has a chapter about Charles Bonnet, which is fascinating. But it was Dr. Dominic Fitch that really helped me I had 3 meetings with him, like in preparation for the book. The first one was kind of mainly taken up with me trying to make him understand what I wanted to do, because comics, I mean, it's the same in the States, but perhaps a little less so. But over here, people think comics are for children or they're superheroes. So when I came to him and said I want to do this like comic about Charles Bonnet Syndrome, it took a while to try and help him to understand what I was actually talking about. And I think I told him to go and have a look in the graphic novels section of, a large bookstore and actually look at what was there. And he did that. And when he came back after that, he understood what I wanted to do then. I think like in the UK as well, we have, like you do all over the world, but particularly in the UK, we've got this sort of subgenre of comics called graphic medicine. The idea being that comics can help people understand conditions, and also they can help doctors understand the experience of patients, and they can raise awareness about conditions, because comics are kind of so subjective. They put you in the position of the main character and you see through their eyes. So there's this whole genre of graphic medicine books, and so once I was able to explain that to him and he actually saw what I was talking about, it was much easier. And after that, he was really helpful. He told me so many anecdotes. I met his whole team. He told me, like, he kind of gave me a list of the typical Charles Bonnet hallucinations, but he also told me to use my own imagination and use my grandma's experience and really just sort of be creative with it. And I think that was important, because once I had that license, I could sort of bring myself to it as well and really get into the character and try and try and imagine what their experience must be like, and kind of try and put that across. So yeah, Dr. Dominic Fitch was very, very helpful. And I think he said his daughter got into comics through this as well. So they came along to my book launch, and that was really nice to hear. But yeah, he was super helpful.
I think I mentioned this earlier, but I think this is the perfect medium, because it's one thing to read and another thing to see. Another thing that I would like is that they actually had some kind of a narrative film about this, and maybe someone can make a film based off your graphic novel. I think, because I think about the movie that M. Night Shyamalan made. Oh, that was based off a graphic novel, and I'm sure there's plenty of others. But it's really something to see. I hope I'm not spoiling the book, but in the beginning of the book, when Miriam saw the windmills, were those hallucinations? Was that kind of like the start of everything?
Well, the windmills weren't hallucinations,
They
but
weren't.
the
Okay, I
flowers
said I was
around
going
them
to
were.
ask you that.
But this is kind of like one of the things that I wanted to do. Like, I wanted to do 2 things. Firstly, I didn't want it to be like a straight graphic medicine narrative where it's about Charles Bonnet syndrome. I think that in modern life, we've got so much that we have to be aware of. So many different things happening all over the world, so many different conditions and experiences and politics, and there's things that are happening to the natural world. There's so much to be worried about. And I think sometimes people get fatigued and they'll switch off if it's about if it's about an issue. So I wanted to make something that had a story that was structured around Charles Bonnet, but wasn't, entirely caught up with just the experience of Charles Bonnet syndrome. And what interested me about that idea was you can go through a narrative, and so there's something in the book, there's something mysterious happening next door that's a little bit weird and a little bit kind of suburban surreal. And she's seeing that, but she's also experiencing her hallucinations at the same time. So the reader needs to navigate that as well and decide for themselves what's a hallucination and what isn't. So yeah, in the UK we have these landscapes that are, have these wind farms, and particularly in the winter when it's snowing, they look very strange, but as she's driving through this kind of snowy wind farm um, landscape, she's kind of hallucinating these flowers as well. So the reader has to decide which is a hallucination, which is what's really happening. And I think that kind of experience as well of disorientation, of having to pick out what's true and what isn't, is something that's becoming really relevant for all of us with, all the social media deep fakes, all these kind of things that are becoming more and more part of our surrounding. We're also having to do that work a little bit ourselves and having to decide what objective reality is. So yeah, that's all in the book. I wanted to explore it all, but I think like having that central experience of Charles Bonnet syndrome is the key to doing that and exploring those themes. But I also did want it to really raise awareness about the condition, particularly as I said, because it's so important to the quality of people's lives who suffer from it to just know what it is. So yeah, that's these are all the things that I was thinking of when I was writing.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I think it's good storytelling not to just beat somebody in the head with one thing or just go right there and just build a whole story around it. So I think that's good. And I saw, at least in the half of the book that I read, and I can't wait to finish it, the flowers were coming up everywhere. And I can't imagine experiencing something like that, because I've heard people that tell me that they have Charles Bonnet syndrome, and when they wake up in the middle of the night and they're seeing someone, eventually they know that their person is not there and they know that they have Charles Bonnet syndrome, but it's still frightening and it still alarms them, and it takes a little while for them to kind of wrap their head around it and deal with it. So if you just look down and you see some flowers and you woke up, or I even seen flowers coming out of the building or something, or I can't imagine walking down the street and seeing a car on fire. So and weaved in with the story too. So yeah, that's really, I think you did a good job. And I think, like you said, it's really important to have people that are caregivers or people that are advocates or people that want to know what it's like to have Charles Bonnet syndrome to read this book, because it actually shows you and speaks about it too.
This is Gary Cusick. One of the things I really admired about the book was how subtle everything was. You demonstrated what the experience of the woman with Charles Bonnet was, simultaneously with her husband's disbelief in what she was seeing and all that sort of thing. And the reader has to sort of work their way through it as well, much as a person with Charles Bonnet does, to try to figure out what the heck's going on.
Yeah.
You must have heard a lot about Charles Bonnet hallucinations, just given what you've got here. I've been listening to people tell me about the hallucinations for several years, and you really have a really amazing, fanciful way of illustrating that. The repetitions where people see an object and it repeats itself, that's really wonderful.
Again, like Dr. Dominic Fitch was really important, like giving me this kind of list of things that I could put in, because they were almost like a little menu that I could choose from. So if I got up that morning and I went to the drawing desk, there'd always be something that would spark inspiration, which was fantastic, and kind of like it allowed me to talk about kind of certain social issues as well. Like you mentioned that the husband, is kind of disbelieving, but it's almost kind of, he doesn't want his cozy little world to be bothered, or to be upended by this problem. And also there's a daughter who is just very worried about money, and there's that kind of generational problem where the younger generation can't afford a house, and she's kind of assumed that she's going to inherit this house, and now she's worried that they're going to have to remortgage it, and she's going to, Miriam is going to have to go into a home. So she's kind of thinking about her, selfishly, but also she's got a child that she's worried about having money to raise. So there's all this kind of, when someone's behavior or their experience doesn't fit with what needs to happen, or the narrative of society, or kind of contradicts the worries that people have in their mind, that person's experience is often kind of like pushed down, or they're told to just keep quiet about it, or they're discouraged from speaking out. And I wanted that to be part of it too.
The disbelief that her husband and her daughter have regarding her experiences are pretty much exactly like what I hear from the folks that I talk to with Charles Bonnet. They're trying to make plans for their loved one to make sure that they're safe and that sort of thing, and they discount their reality, and that's certainly true in this one, because Miriam is about ready to save this poor young man next door, and nobody believes her. That must be part of the hallucination as well, and given the situation, it is pretty hallucinatory.
And the situation with the young man, without spoiling it too much, is another true story that happened in the same town where I grew up. So there's nothing in the book that's, even though it's a surreal book with lots of bizarre images and events, it's all of it happened and was experienced.
There's a lot of verisimilitude throughout the whole book in terms of things happening that seem just so, the world that they happen in is so consistent that it must have happened for real somewhere.
Yeah, well, it did.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the other things that you do?
Sure. So I mean, I'm doing the PhD that I mentioned about tactility and haptic visuality in comics. What that means is when you use unusual materials, like the Thousand Colored Castles was made using wax crayon, and it was a specific method where you do a drawing with wax crayons, and then you cover the whole drawing up with black crayon, so it's completely black, and then you scrape it back, and the black wax crayon kind of, where the crayon resists the top layer, so where there isn't any wax crayon, that turns black, if you see what I mean. It's kind of complicated. If you go on my Instagram and scroll all the way down to like 2017, you can see me doing it, but it does something to the color and to the surface, and it makes it very lurid and surreal. And also there's something about the process where you make it all black and then scrape it back that's a little bit of a metaphor for loss of vision. And I do that with all my comics. So my latest one's called The Dancing Plague, and it's about the dancing plague, medieval dancing plagues. This was a thing. No one knows why, they danced themselves to serious injury or even death en masse, 200, 300 people at a time. And I made that using pyrography, which is a burning tool on calico. And I also used embroidery, which is that's a method that I use quite a lot in my comics. So what I'm researching is how these different methods and materials create different reading experiences for the reader based on imagined tactility. But I've also been involved with other people's research projects about how to make comics for partially sighted people. So there was one that could mean using polymers, raised polymer printing technology, so it's kind of like a braille, or it could mean audio description and things like that. So it's funny how kind of, at least in terms of macular degeneration, loss of sight, my research has also carried me back into those areas as well, even though it's been 8 years, I think, since I published this book.
How do you decide what techniques you want to use for which project?
It just kind of feels right. And sometimes I have ideas for graphic novels or projects in my head for ages, and they're just floating around in there. And then I find the material that I want to use, and suddenly it becomes a project in my mind. So I just have to wait until I find a material that fits the narrative.
Has anybody from the CBS community, whether they actually have CBS themselves or their caregiver or researcher, have they reached out to you and said that they read your book and had any thoughts or comments that they shared with you?
I've had people read my book and then know about Charles Bonnet, and then had a loved one who's developed it, and they've been able to recognise it, and get a diagnosis, and that's brilliant. That's exactly kind of like what I hope for. That's happened a few times, and yeah, it's kind of like the best, the best feedback you can ever get, really, because it's like my books had an impact on someone's life, and they haven't had to go through that worry.
I like that it's very informative for family members that wouldn't have any understanding of what Miriam's experience would be like, and as well as no insight into what they're doing themselves in terms of discounting the person with Charles Bonnet. Is there a reason you decided to go without faces on the characters? I know there are faces in there, but the characters don't have faces.
I think there's a bunch of reasons, and like I remember my publisher being a bit kind of like, why is there no faces? But I think one thing was that I wanted it to have like a low level of detail in terms of the fact that you are seeing it through quite fuzzy, someone who is suffering from macular degeneration. So that's one reason, and I think one way to kind of simulate that in a really effective way is just to take away the facial features, because then you really feel like you're not seeing interactions, you're not seeing the world properly. Another reason is I think that when you remove those facial expressions, the reader has to do a bit of work to fill it in, and I actually think it can be more empathic, where they have to kind of guess a little bit how the character's feeling from other information. And also I think it kind of adds a little to the kind of slightly uncanny feeling of the whole book. But I don't know, like I can say that now, but at the time that I was doing it, I didn't really have an answer as to why I didn't want to put faces in. But yes,
Okay.
It's an unusual choice.
A lot of the folks that I talk to that have Charles Bonnet will see, people, and the people themselves don't have faces. So that really struck me also. The book struck me on a variety of levels, to say nothing of my wife, who suddenly understood Charles Bonnet a lot better. She'd been hearing me talk about it for years, but never really had a good sense of what it was. And she's so excited about this. She's trying to get it put into all the libraries here in Louisville, Kentucky.
Oh, great.
And she's probably going to succeed because she was a former administrator, and she knows all the right people for that.
Right. Well, thanks very much to her.
Have you ever thought about, I know you have many other projects and many other passions, but have you ever thought about making like a continuation or part two, or somehow doing some other kind of project to illustrate CBS?
I kind of, it was 3 years, and by the end of it, I was kind of, I was tired of it. I'm still fascinated by Charles Bonnet as a condition, but particularly, at the end of a graphic novel, and you have to do all the photoshopping and the formatting and all these things, you can really fall out of love with your project. So it's probably it took me a few years to really be sort of interested in that crayon process again, and to be sort of I didn't really want to hear all that much about Charles Bonnet Syndrome after, because I'd done so much and been thinking about it all the time for about 3 years. But I would not rule that out. I think it's really interesting. And like, I was a bit aghast actually, because I listened to your Judith Potts episode, how it still isn't really being diagnosed properly, and there still isn't a lot of awareness around getting that diagnosis, and people still don't seem to know about it enough. So I might do something, but I kind of like, after I'd finished the book and having been surrounded by people and talking to people like Dominic Fitch that do know about it, I don't know, I kind of lazily assumed that awareness would just grow and people would be aware of it fully by now, and every doctor would would know that it's a possibility that someone might be experiencing it, because it's not a rare condition like I was told it was when my grandma was suffering from it. I can't remember the statistic, but I think it was like 1 in 10 or 20% of people with macular degeneration experienced Charles Bonnet Syndrome. It was something like that, which is a lot of people considering that most people over 70 have some degree of macular degeneration or cataracts or something. So I would have thought that, you know, I'm surprised that it's still not in the public awareness as it should be.
Well, thank you for finishing the book. There's a lot of artists that have half-written movies, half-written books, and
Yeah.
half-painted paintings and all of that. So in 3 years is a real big commitment. I'm sure your grandmother would be proud of you. And also, it's amazing how good, for lack of better words, art is and how much it can touch people and be necessary, because I'm thinking of medical literature or having some kind of like Judith has pop-up days, and all of that's very important because she's at the forefront and medical literature is important. But who would think that a book written by someone in England would go around the world and be published and be potentially getting into libraries in Louisville, Kentucky, and you'll be on multiple podcasts. And then you mentioned that you had a family member read it and then was able to get diagnosed. Like, you never know how far your art can go and what you can do if you stay consistent and follow that vision. And it's not easy. 3 years of your life. And it sounds like you were really strict. You dedicated yourself. You took it serious. And I just want to commend you for that.
Thank you.
Mon, is there a way can we put a link to Amazon for the book or something like that? I don't know if that's okay with you, Gareth.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
okay, yes, certainly.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I'm going to ask you to say your information, your website and all of that, just in case someone has a visual impairment or would like to hear it verbally.
Okay.
And then I'm also going to put it in the show notes, like Dr. Gary Cusick said, a link to your website, which has links to your books and other information so people can maybe contact you. But yeah, if you don't mind giving whatever you would like to share, whether it's your website, email, whatever you would like to share so people can follow you or get to know you and
Sure.
stay on top of it.
So my website's www.gbrooks.com. It's Brooks with an ES. So it's just gbrooks.com. And on there's links to all the books and my Instagram. And also there's a form where you can contact me if you'd like to. So that's where everything is, gbrooks.com.
Okay, that's nice and simple and easy, and I'll definitely add that in the show notes. Is there anything that you would like to share in closing?
Well, thanks for having me on this podcast. And, you know, it is a while since I wrote the book, and, you know, like, it can feel like once you've finished a project like that, it's just done. And, you know, you have a book launch and people make a bit of a fuss about it for a few months, but after that it feels like it just, you know, no one's interested anymore. So it's really lovely to be contacted and get another chance to talk about the book, and to know that, you know, there's people out there reading it, and that it's, you know, perhaps even there might be more people that read it and then can recognize the signs of Charles Bonnet Syndrome, and, you know, just spread the word about it so people don't have to, you know, think that they're losing their mind or whatever. They might think that it's a condition and that it's scary but harmless. And yeah, that's a good feeling.
It's amazing how books can take a life of their own and get popular and then get less popular and then gain popularity again. I don't want to mess it up, but I think of that quote from Benjamin Franklin where he said, if you don't want to be forgotten, do something that is worth writing about, or write something that's worth reading, something like that. And just to write something that's just going to go down in history. There's books that are printed and something that really is helpful, especially when you highlight a condition like this that needs more awareness. And I just think that's a great thing.
Right.
I really like that it's a hardbound book, you know, with the pages sewn in and all that sort of thing. So it's very much not like a comic book or even like most graphic novels that you'll see that are just put together like magazines, and it gives it some more credibility, I guess, authority.
I think, yeah, it definitely it gives it some authority, but also, some tactility, some presence. It smells quite nice because there's a lot of spot ink on the pages. So yeah, it kind of appeals to the other senses as well as vision. Like the more time you spend on it as an object. I mean, I was lucky. My publisher was willing to spend a bit of money and do a bit of work on the design, which they're not always prepared to do. Sometimes graphic novels as a kind of medium are selling better at some stages than at others, and I think right now they're kind of like trying to find ways to make it a bit cheaper. So it was nice for it to come out at a time when that they were willing to invest. But yeah, it kind of it you can feel it, you can smell it. It has some weight to it, and I like it when a book can do that.
And can you tell us about some of your other graphic novels that you've written or going to write?
So I've got some projects on the go, but they're not really ready to talk about, and I need to finish my PhD as well. The Dancing Plague one was the one I mentioned earlier about the medieval dancing plagues, and the
Mhm.
other one is called the Black Project, and it's about a boy, a kind of lonely boy who makes girlfriends out of things that he finds lying around the house, and he
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
has
Interesting.
like strange romantic relationships with them. And it's kind of it's about, again, like all my books are kind of about people that aren't listened to because they're doing something or behaving in a way or experiencing something that's slightly out of the ordinary. And in his case, he's not developing into being a heterosexual man in the way that's expected of him. And it's a kind of a black comedy. It's not supposed to
Okay.
be too serious. That one's made using lino cut and embroidery. And apart from that, I've got lots of little smaller comics, but they take so long to make. That first one took 5 years, so I'm getting quicker.
You really have a knack for bringing the fantastic to life, and and in terms of understanding, also.
Well, thanks very much. I hope so.
And so we definitely appreciate your time, and everyone definitely get the book, A Thousand Colored Castles, and it's available on Amazon and other places where books are sold. And you can definitely go to Garrick's website. That's G Brooks with an ES at the end, gbrooks.com, right?
Yep,
Okay. So I'll put that in the show notes, and we definitely appreciate you sharing this story. And thanks for the commitment and writing the book and talking with us today.
no problem. Thanks very much for having me on.